Hey everybody, hope you're all doing okay. I know it's been a really long time. I put this little video together to give us a chance to review what we've done so far, what we did together, and then kind of bring together all the bits and pieces that you've been doing this week while I've been away. I'm sure there's been I'm sure there's been coronavirus jokes going around. No, I do not have the coronavirus. I will talk to you about why I was away when I get back. I should be back by Monday, so hopefully by then you would have had a chance to review everything up to now, and then hopefully we'll have a quiz sometime at the end of next week. Yes, a quiz, or as I like to call them, a celebration of learning. So, if you can have your notes with you right now, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is page 8, and we've done this before, but I'm going to do a quick review and then go on to the next page, and then you'll be able to review this stuff this weekend at home. If you don't have your notes with you, you can access this document on Moodle under the Genetics tab. So if you remember, we talked about sex chromosomes and how humans have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs, the last pair of chromosomes being the sex chromosomes. Now we've talked about the sex chromosomes either being an X or a Y. We talked about how in order for it, if it's a girl, it's XX, if it's a boy, it's XY. When we get each chromosome, we get one chromosome from each parent. Now, sometimes on these chromosomes, there are genes that are responsible for certain traits, and these are called sex-linked traits. The two that we talked about and that you are responsible for are hemophilia and colorblindness. So these are basically the sex-linked traits you're responsible for. You should know if there's a Punnett square problem that talks about hemophilia or colorblindness, you are responsible to know that they are sex-linked, and you are responsible to know that they are recessive. That information will not be given to you. So this is something that you need to remember. So if you remember, we had looked at the different possible genotypes in these scenarios. So if you're a girl, you're XX, and you have 3 possible scenarios. In order to be colorblind or a hemophiliac, for example, you need to have, because it's a recessive trait, you need to have 2 lowercase h's. And remember, we represent that with the 2 x's, and we use our genotypic letters, let's say, we use them as kind of like exponents or superscripts. Okay, now if you have an uppercase H and a lowercase h, that means you're a carrier. You do not have the disease, but you are carrying the gene for that trait or that illness. And if you're uppercase, then you don't have it at all. Now, for men, there's only 2 possibilities. Sorry. Let's erase that. If I could just find the eraser here. So for men, you can either have it or you cannot. You can never be a carrier because males only have one X chromosome, and these traits that we talk about when we talk about sex-linked traits, we talk about traits that are only on the X chromosomes, not on the Y. The X chromosome, being a bigger chromosome, has more possibility of carrying certain what we call sex-linked traits. Now, if you go to the next page of your notes, if I'm not mistaken, it should be this one, and it's about human genetic disorders. For some of my classes, we've already gone through this. That's okay. This will just be a review. Now, what you can do is, as I go through them, you can perhaps highlight the notes or the points that I'm highlighting. Okay, so when we talk about human genetic disorders, we talk about genetic disorders that affect some part or structure of a chromosome or a gene. Now, it could be a mutation. When we talk about mutation, we talk about changes in the DNA that cause a change in the gene, okay? Or we can talk about a change in the number or the structure of the actual chromosome. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit later. So if we look at the first one is cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is basically when your body produces too much, like a really thick mucus, too much mucus in the lungs and the intestines. Now, what does this do? If we think about what the role of the lungs and intestines are, we know that this extra mucus, or this abnormally thick mucus, will, for one, obstruct the airways. In other words, it will not allow the alveoli to exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide, and it will affect chemical digestion, in the sense that the mucus may block enzymes from going into the intestines to chemically digest your food, or it may even prevent nutrients from being absorbed into your small intestine, into your bloodstream. So those are the negative effects of cystic fibrosis. The disorder, we highlight here, the disorder doesn't affect that many babies. 1 in 2,500 newborns are diagnosed with cystic fibrosis in the United States. It's caused by a recessive allele on the chromosome. Okay, so basically, in order to have cystic fibrosis, and it's not like sex-linked, so we could say that if you have cystic fibrosis, you're a lowercase d, lowercase d. If you have uppercase d, lowercase d, you're simply carrying the gene. And if you're uppercase d, you do not have the illness. Okay, so that's cystic fibrosis. Now, the next one, sickle cell disease. We've kind of already talked about together when we talked about the cardiovascular system. Sickle cell disease basically affects your hemoglobin, or affects the way in which your red blood cells carry oxygen. Instead of the normal circular red blood cells, remember, sickle cell, people with sickle cell have red blood cells that are shape of a sickle. It's not a very good diagram, but you get the idea. It basically affects the way that oxygen is transported into your blood. Okay, so people with sickle cell will suffer from lack of oxygen, they may feel pain or weakness, etc. Now, the allele that causes sickle cell is co-dominant. Now, what does that mean exactly? Okay, it means that basically, if in order to have sickle cell disease, you would have to be, for example, lowercase. So that would mean that you have it. If you are uppercase, it means that you do not have it. If you are uppercase, lowercase, it basically means that you're a carrier. You're carrying the gene for sickle cell. You do not have sickle cell disease. However, if someone were to take a sample of your blood, you would have some visible red blood cells that were shaped like a sickle. In other words, you have some red blood cells that are abnormally shaped, but you do not have the symptoms of the disease. And it's important that you remember that. Okay, again, sickle cell disease is not sex-linked, so that's why we don't have to indicate the X's and the Y chromosomes in the genotype. Okay, it's co-dominant, which means that if you're a carrier, you may have sickle cell shaped red blood cells, but you do not have the symptoms of the disease. Our third one, and we've already talked about this one before, is hemophilia. Hemophilia is a sex-linked disorder, which means it's a disorder that's found on the X chromosome. It's a disorder where your blood doesn't clot or clots very little. People basically with the disorder, we've talked about this when we talked about the cardiovascular system, they don't produce the certain protein that's responsible for clotting. Now, we already said that it's caused by a recessive allele on the X chromosome. It's sex-linked. You need to remember this. Okay, so in other words, we'd use our X and Y chromosomes for a female, you wouldn't have it. You would be either a carrier or you would actually have it if you had both recessive genes on the X chromosome. For males, remember, they either have it or they do not have it. Now, lastly, we have Down syndrome. From the four human genetic disorders that you're responsible for knowing, Down syndrome is the only one where it's caused by an extra chromosome 21. In other words, instead of having 46 chromosomes total, you have 47. You have a third copy of chromosome 21. This basically occurs when, during cell division, when sperm cells or egg cells are formed, the chromosomes do not divide properly between the two cells, and one cell will end up getting more chromosomes. So it's something that goes wrong in cell division. I know we haven't really studied cell division, but it's basically when sperm cells and egg cells, it's a process where sperm cells and egg cells are formed. People with Down syndrome have particular physical features. They have a certain degree of where their IQs are low. They can lead, however, pretty normal lives. They're fairly independent. They can hold up jobs. They usually have some sort of heart problems. But over the years, with medical advances, their life expectancy has increased quite a bit. Okay, so those are the four human genetic disorders that you're responsible for knowing. Now, if you go to the next page, we talk about pedigrees. Now, these are basically just family trees, okay? And I think you saw a video, an amoeba sister video with a worksheet. Squares are males, circles are females. When it's shaded in, that shows that the person has the illness. And then with a pedigree, we can kind of track how a disorder passes from one generation to the next. In this particular one, I don't know if you noticed that it's mostly the males that have the illness. Okay. We could maybe even assume that this is a sex-linked trait or disorder. Okay. Again, this is not just necessarily tracking diseases or disorders. It can also just track a particular trait that you want to see in a family. So we will talk more about this when I get back. But I want you to remember that a pedigree is kind of like a family tree, and it helps track a certain disorder or trait through the generations. Okay, we've already talked about karyotypes. Karyotype is a picture of someone's chromosome. It can tell us if a person is missing a chromosome, has an extra chromosome, or is missing a piece of a chromosome. So you can have shorter chromosomes that are missing particular genes. Okay, now a karyotype would be helpful in, for example, diagnosing or seeing if someone has a disorder like Down syndrome, where there's an extra copy of chromosome 21. A karyotype would not help us know would not help us figure out if someone had color blindness, for example, or even hemophilia, okay, or even some other, or cystic fibrosis, because those are traits or disorders that a particular gene is affected, or the DNA of a particular chromosome is affected. So we wouldn't be able to tell from a karyotype. Okay, so I'd like you to go over these 2 pages of the notes at home this weekend. That's your homework. You will be given a worksheet soon on blood types. So you can complete that for the rest of the class, and your homework is basically just to review what we've done so far and to be ready for perhaps a quiz late next week after I return and we've gone over stuff in person. Now, before we go, I will ask you to do 2 problems for which I will go over right after, and so I'd like you to do these now as we finish up. So have a look at these. You can complete them on a separate piece of paper using Punnett squares. Pause the video, give yourself a chance to try these, and I will go over the answers. So for the first one, Susan is colorblind, her brother is not. What are her mother and father's genotypes and phenotypes for colorblindness? Now, we have to use a Punnett square. Okay, we're given two pieces of information. Susan is colorblind, her brother is not. First thing we need to remember is that colorblindness is sex-linked, which means that Susan would be X with two lowercase h's, and her brother would not be colorblind, which means he would have to be this genotype. Now, if we were to do the Punnett square, automatically we would know that her father is colorblind. Since he contributes one of the X chromosomes, we know for sure that he is colorblind, which would also lead us to conclude that her mother has is a carrier of the colorblindness gene. So if we fill this in, this would be Susan. Now, since her brother is not colorblind and males will get their X chromosomes from their mothers, we can already fill in the fact that she is a carrier, which allowed her to have, so the mother is a carrier, the father is colorblind, which allowed them to both have a daughter who's colorblind and a son who is not. Okay, so in these kind of examples, you see colorblindness, you have to know that it's that colorblindness is a sex-linked trait. You have to know that it's a recessive sex-linked trait, and then be able to fill in the Punnett square. Now, for the second problem, Jeffrey just found out that he has some abnormally shaped red blood cells, but has none of the symptoms of sickle cell disease. His wife, however, has the disease. Using the Punnett squares, determine the possible genotypes and phenotypes of their offspring. So, if we look at this one, we look at sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease is not sex-linked. Okay, so we know for sure that Jeffrey, or Jeff, let's call him Jeff, has some abnormally shaped red blood cells. If you remember from the notes we just covered just now, sickle cell disease is codominant, which means if he has some abnormally shaped red blood cells, but he doesn't have the actual disease, then he must be a carrier. Now, if his wife does have the disease, then she must be lowercase, which would mean that we can fill in the Punnett square and see the possibilities here. So we basically have a 50% chance of having the illness. Sorry, I'm going to be a little lazy here. And a 50% chance of having offspring who are carriers. And I will fill this in like this. Okay, so we have carriers and we have 50% chance of having a child that has the illness. I hope this was helpful. This will be available on Moodle if you need it to review or anything. And please make sure you fill out or you complete the worksheet that's going to be given to you today. If you do not finish it, you hand it in to the substitute and you can continue it next time. Thank you.